Tuesday marks the first of 3 presidential debates between President Donald Trump and his challenger, former Vice President Joe Biden. The two will appear face-to-face in Cleveland, where they are expected to tackle several key issues. Among the most pressing topics includes the president's efforts to confirm a Supreme Court justice ahead of the November election. In addition, Mr. Trump has recently made headlines by refusing to commit to a peaceful transition of power if the outcome of this election is not in his favor. CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has the latest.
Joe Biden traveled to the U.S. Capitol Friday to attend the memorial service for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Democratic presidential candidate's first in-person appearance with his running mate Kamala Harris since the Democratic convention more than a month ago.
I was the chairman of the committee, and I was when she was confirmed.
In an interview that aired Friday, Biden responded to President Trump's recent refusal to pledge a peaceful transfer of power if he loses.
We'll have an election in this country as we always have had, and he'll leave.
Mr. Trump has stoked concerns that the wider use of absentee ballots could delegitimize the election.
We know that there were thousands and thousands of ballots that made the difference through cheating. We're not going to stand for it. We're not going to stand for it. So just remember, keep your eyes open.
What I am concerned about is whether he generates some kind of response in a way that unsettles the society or causes some kind of violence.
New polls show Biden is leading narrowly in battleground states including Nevada, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. That's partly why the president is maintaining an aggressive campaign schedule, which stops in 3 states on Friday.
I just left Florida, and from here I'm going to Washington, then I'm going to Virginia, then I'm going to someplace else and someplace else.
He gave supporters a preview of his debate strategy.
So Biden's a weak guy, I think. We have a debate coming up. It'll be interesting. It's like going into a match, same kind of thing, a little bit less physical.
CBS News campaign reporter Nicole Sganga joins us now from Washington to get even deeper into this. So, Nicole, looking ahead, we have 3 debates in total leading up to the November election. What's at stake for the candidates on Tuesday night?
Well, thanks for having me, Lana. And I think 2 things are true here. The first is that there's just a small sliver of voters out there that are still undecided, according to Quinnipiac and Monmouth polling that came out last week. It's about 3%. But the other thing we can say is that in a lot of these battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, the list goes on, it might come down to just about that many voters. We saw a lot of close contests back in 2016, and both camps, the Biden camp and the Trump camp, understand that this race is tightening and that they need a debate performance that solidifies their base and distinguishes themselves for those swing voters that they're still trying to get a hold of. For former Vice President Joe Biden, folks haven't seen him on the trail quite as much. This is an opportunity for him to define himself, to refocus the message ahead of Election Day on what has become a referendum on the president's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, and also disprove some of the claims that the Trump campaign has been trying to make about his own mental fitness, and prove that he can really keep his own on this debate stage. Meanwhile, the challenge for President Trump, who is used to going out into the public eye in these rallies, these big stages, will be, to make the argument against Joe Biden, to continue making his case while still being fact-checked. We've seen the president, fabricate the position of Joe Biden to allege that he is, in support of defunding the police, that there's voter fraud. Some of these false claims are now going to be called out by a debate moderator.
Yeah, and Biden himself saying that he wanted to be a fact checker. So, Nicole, remember back in 2016 when we saw then candidate Donald Trump in a debate setting for the first time? What's he doing to prepare for this round of debates? I'm wondering how his debate prep specifically has changed now that he has been president for nearly 4 years.
It's a good question, Lana. And this time around, the debate prep is a little less formal. So instead of hosting these forums at Bedminster with a dozen of his closest advisors, he's been using flashcards to prep on Air Force One in between campaign stops. He's been reviewing videos. His team has been reviewing videos of past debate performances from Joe Biden to try to build an arsenal of attacks that the president can use on stage. And, you know, the campaign and some of the president's closest White House advisors tell us that they think Donald Trump has been preparing, the president has been preparing just by hosting daily press availabilities. What they say are interactions with hostile news media are preparing him to take on any question that comes, towards him on stage.
Well, what about Vice President Biden? Remember, he started off the debates during the primary with something of a whimper, and then he gained a little bit of steam. How is he in particular preparing, particularly for the barbs that we can expect coming from President Trump?
Yeah, well, the Trump campaign will be the first to tell you that Joe Biden is no stranger to the debate stage. And so in addition to these 3 presidential debates that he's doing, he's already been through 11 primary debates this cycle. You know, it feels like a year ago that we were looking at that crowded Democratic primary, but it wasn't too long ago that we saw Biden on stage. And in recent days, he has been huddling with his closest advisors, doing some more formal debate prep and preparing for some of the attacks his advisors anticipate the president will throw his way.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court. Obviously, that is the big issue today. President Trump, we understand, has settled on Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court, and he recently said that he might not accept the results of the election come November. How are we expecting this to be addressed by both campaigns on Tuesday?
Yeah, well, let's unpack this a little bit. So the president has long said that part of his legacy is appointing conservative Supreme Court justices. Of course, you know, in Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch that we've seen so far, and also nearly 300 conservative judges to the lower court. So this is part of his argument of why he should be elected for a second term, particularly to his evangelical base, right? At the same time, the president will be looking to make the case that it is his right to nominate a new judge to fill that vacancy on the Supreme Court right now, and that the Senate should hear from that judge and should confirm her before Election Day. And he said just yesterday at a rally in Newport News that wouldn't it be great if this, justice was confirmed going into the election? He thinks it might, give him a boost. Now, as for his comments about the transition of power, yesterday the president sort of walked this back a little bit. He said he wants a smooth and beautiful transition, but that he also wants a free and fair election. So again, the president, sowing doubts about the election results, particularly vote by mail, some unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud there. We've seen President Trump's allies also try to suggest that if the general election is litigated, if election results are challenged in some of these battleground states, we will need a full Supreme Court with 9 justices in order to hear some of that litigation. So again, tying those two things together. As far as the Biden camp is concerned,
actually, Nicole,
former Vice President. Yeah, please.
I want to ask you about that because, as you mentioned, part of the president's campaign strategy for the election has been to galvanize conservative voters around the Supreme Court. So it seems as an election strategy that it could be more advantageous to the Trump campaign if the question of the justice to replace Ginsburg was still unsettled. I'm wondering, comparing that campaign desire to galvanize voters with the other thing that we have heard from the president, that he feels like he needs his justice to be seated on the bench to decide the election results. How are they weighing those two things? Because certainly he can make the appeal to voters that they need to, if they don't like him, hold their noses and still punch their ballots for him, because this justice holds in the fate of the Supreme Court is in balance. But he very much wants that justice to be seated to help secure, he thinks, an election victory. So how are those two things being reconciled within the Trump campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important point, Lana, that you point out, because on the one hand, of course, the president's supporters feel strongly that he needs to be elected to a second term to continue, nominating justices and judges to both the Supreme Court and the lower courts. And yes, the, Trump campaign acknowledges that this is a motivating factor, that if that vacancy is not filled before Election Day, of course, you might see, greater turnout or more energy among the president's base to turn out that support, to ensure that, it is the president who goes on to fill that Supreme Court seat. But at the same time, the president himself has consistently stated that he would like that seat to be filled before Election Day. And as you point out, he oftentimes cites that election litigation that might come post-November if we are still waiting on some election results from some of these states, if we do need the high court to sort this out as they did back during the 2000 election. And so, it's the president's desire to fill this seat as soon as possible. The last thing I'll point out here is that voting has already started in over half of states. Absentee ballots have gone out in over half of states. We've seen early in-person voting in a lot of battleground states, including Minnesota and Virginia. So even though we're not quite at Election Day just yet, Lana, people are still voting every single day. The president is encouraging them to vote every single day. And so even though that seat is not quite yet filled, even if it is filled before Election Day, it's motivating voters right now.
Yeah, that's true. All right, I want to circle back around to Biden. CBS News polls do show that Biden is leading in several key swing states, but it is close. So how will he use this debate to try and solidify his position, particularly there?
Yeah, and so the Biden campaign is really looking to refocus the argument of this election, which, they would like to be a referendum on the president's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and also health care. We talk about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will hear just a week after Election Day, weigh in on whether or not they're going to strike down the Affordable Care Act. And that is significant for, tens of millions of Americans whose healthcare insurance, really lies on the Affordable Care Act and the continuation of this Obama-era policy. And so the Biden campaign and former Vice President Joe Biden himself looking to make a healthcare argument, a recovery from the coronavirus pandemic argument here, and really just trying to stand out on stage, trying to hold their own on stage on September 29th. We should point out that if this debate doesn't go quite as planned, there are 2 more debates expected for October. So this is just round 1 of 3. But again, a very important moment given what we already know about people voting every day in this country on this sort of early calendar we've seen in 2020.
All right, Nicole Sganga, thank you.
Thank you.